okay like that?
I think we'll try to make it less formal and people can introduce themselves.
Okay.
It's okay. I saw that you had written something that was kind of like an
No, I didn't want to come, that's all. I'm always a little scared when I have to talk in public, especially in English. You will understand why very soon. So, for a while, about 2 months ago, no, 1 month ago to be exact, I knit. And it makes me remind that I have hands. And it makes me remind, as philosopher, because I'm a philosopher, to pay attention to the stuff of the world and to the making of what we do when we do stories and theories. And, thank you, the necessity to write and to speak and to write, especially to write in 3 dimensions. And to knit helps me to remind that. My work is to knit stories, and I knit stories with animals, and for doing so, I knit stories with scientists who themselves knit stories with animals. Because animals are good to think with, and are good to make stories with, and are good to live with, and they make the stuff of life and the stuff of world more diverse, richer, denser, stickier, and more interesting. I knit stories in the hope of making us more sensitive, more creative, more porous. And this is why I knit stories with some scientists and not with others. And I also pay careful attention to the way we become able to make animals real actors of these stories, of our stories and of our story, and not mere support of our representation, mere tools of our actions. This is why I am interested in scientists who seek for or who try to understand the point of view of the animals they meet and learn to respond to. Some of these scientists seek to let the animals tell what's important for them and for an animal to say what is important for, I say, him or her, contrary to some traditional way of speaking animals. And what is important is may translate the point of view of the animals. Other scientists define the work as the attempt to see the world from the point of view, from the perspective of the animals. And I really like the way ethologist Donald Griffin define it in its own practice, the way he defined the perspective of an animal. He says that each animal is a way of knowing the world. It's a way of knowing, to cool. I love to think that animals as a way of knowing, of feeling, of thinking, that enrich the world, because I'm convinced, so was William James, the great philosopher, that the world is feeling, knowing, thinking itself through the beings that compose it. There are many ways to construct another point of view, and I'm not going to explore all these ways. I just would like to consider the specific path that lead from this point of view, from that perspective, considering a given animal as a viewpoint upon the world, to agency, to the fact that animal can be an actor in the stories we tell about them or with them, or an animal gains agency through perspective or point of view. Let's say that, briefly put, the first clear theorization of the point of view for an animal appear. Maybe some of you know that's the work of Jacob von Uxküll. And his theory is famous under the name of Umwelt theory. According to the Umwelt theory, or according to Jacob von Uxküll, animals only perceive things that have meaning for them. Things that have no meaning are not perceived. Moreover, animal construe meanings in acting. A thing is taking a meaning of the action that it renders possible. If I was an animal, the microphone would take meaning of microphone as soon as I notice that you hear me when I talk in it. And therefore, as soon as a thing gets a meaning, it begins to exist for a given animal. So according to the Umwelt theory, a scientist therefore may make an inventory of what makes animals act and react, whether they react or not, and this scientist may therefore infer what the animal perceives and what the perceived things mean for this animal. Von Uxküll, I should emphasize, did not so much aim to adopt the animal perspective. It was, this story is more contemporary, to adopt, to feel like an animal, to think like an animal, to be inside his head or inside his mind or inside his heart. For von Uxküll, we are in the half of the 20th century, and it's a biologist, which is different from other scientists I'm working with. Rather, for von Uxküll, while collecting meanings, because that was his job, collecting meanings, he wanted to rebuild the world as each animal perceives it, to populate this world with all the things that exist for given animals, and to identify the meaning all these things take for this animal. The paradigmatic example associated with the name of von Uxküll is the tick. You know, the tick, the little animal that lives in the wood and tick, that your dog sometimes bring back home and sometimes your legs. And the tick is a word, and this word is composed of only 3, 4, maybe 5 phenomena. First, the smell of the butyric acid that mammals produce when sweating. Second, the heat of the animal's body. Third, the taste of a warm liquid, the blood of the victim. And fourth, the feeling of the fur. I like to translate von Uxküll's proposal with the word of Griffin. A tick is a way of knowing a world, and to think of our world as constitute of an infinite series of different ways of knowing, feeling, and being affected. The possibility for an animal to have or to build its own world and to give meaning to things leads to the possibility in von Uxküll's work that the animal might become a real subject. That's exactly how von Uxküll defines an animal. It's subject because as he constructs a world, he's subject of this world. And is the subject of his own perception and meanings. This possibility opens the path for a more active conception of the animal. If perception is to be a pathos, this pathos, however, does not imply passivity. Rather, it testifies to an active endeavor that fills the world with meaningful objects and things. Von Uxküll had directly or indirectly marked influence on the field of ethologists and even primatologists. However, I was surprised to discover that the fate of von Uxküll's proposal has been really less promising than one might expect among the scientists that have been influenced by his theories. You know Karl Lorenz, maybe, this very famous German ethologist. He's from Austria, excuse me. And he's very famous because we saw a movie about him being followed by little duck and goose and swimming, and for his theories of imprinting, because he adopts goose and ducks as soon as they hatch from the eggs. 13 hours for the goose, and the goose is imprinted and believed that Lawrence is the goose mother, and So he is supposed to act like a goose mother and swim with the goose and so on. It's very funny, and it's very, very interesting theories. I mean, theories not. I mean, interesting practice. Lawrence practice is a wonderful domesticating practice. He knows that to study living beings, you have to love them, and you have to be with them, and to act with them. But if I can say, and if I can even celebrate the fact that Lawrence really tried to understand other animals' mind, I have to observe, following the sociologist Ellen Christ, that this didn't prevent Lawrence from objectifying the animals with the instinct theory. Lawrence is very famous for the instinct theory, and this instinct theory really make animals as mechanistic beings. That is really strange, because you have a practice in the one side, with Lawrence swimming and adopting and trying to fly with the jackdaws he adopts, and failing in it, but anyway trying hard to be with jackdaws. And on the other side, you have a very rigid, mechanistic theory of instinct. And Ellen Christ, the sociologist, illustrates that, taking into contrast the same story, saying from the point of view of Darwin, a naturalistic point of view, and told by Lawrence. And this story is the story of a peacock Darwin has observed. And Darwin says about this peacock that the peacock wanders the path of appropriate seduction, because this peacock was performing in front of a pig. You know, the peacock, the performance of a peacock. So this rather counterproductive behavior from the point of view of natural selection, nevertheless finds in Darwin's world its full legitimation. The peacock, Darwin explains, evidently wishes for some spectator of some kind, and will show off its, do you say finery or finery? Finery, as I've often seen before poultry or even pigs. I know one who did in front of a cow, but that's another problem. All naturalists, say Darwin, who have closely attended to the habit of birds are unanimously of opinion that the males delight to display their beauty. All naturalists, indeed, provided we confine our scope in the 19th century. Because for this depiction takes a radically different shape when told from a classical ethology standpoint in the mid-20th century. The display becomes, and I say in Conrad Lawrence's word, the display is a fixed action pattern that is innately given behavioral pattern with certain inner specific energies associated with them. According to Lawrence, the appropriate behavior pattern is released by the appropriate stimulus, which means that the stimulus signal that if this appropriate stimulus is absent, that's the vocabulary Lawrence used, for a long period, the energies accumulate inside the animals and can finally trigger in the face of an inappropriate stimulus the expression of the behavioral pattern. Did you understand? If not, that's normal. I think that was written for that, in order to be only understood by scientists and not by naturalistic and people who love animals and who could pretend they know animals. No, they don't know animals anymore because they cannot understand that. I think that was the stake of that. Anyway, in this case, says Lawrence, the response of the peacock or any animal that didn't meet the right stimulus, the response go off in vacuo. This is the technical term. The response go off in vacuo. in vacuo, meaning here, a pig. For Darwin, it seems obvious that the bird is so vividly fixated on the fact that the display is for showing his beauty that he himself is able, this peacock, is able to decontextualize the action from its proper occasion. So it's creative. A bird becomes creative, inventive, make improvisation just because of beauty. In Darwin's portrayal, the peacock finally gains agency as an inhabitant of an aesthetic and exhibitionist world in which he is really, actually, evidently the author of his action. By contrast, we may remark, in classical ethological depiction in Lawrence, the bird is oblivious to the meaning of his action. He doesn't know what he does. The technical terms and the logical connection account for a behavior that is not performed by an agent, but that happens to it. In the one case, excuse me, the animal acts, even ridiculously, Christ says, the sociology Christ says, but from which point of view is it ridiculous, finally? In the other, the animal is acted by some drive upon which it has absolutely no control. The difference between the two descriptions is finally parallels with von Uexküll's distinction between a dog and a sea urchin. You see a sea urchin? Okay, everybody knows the word? Okay. Von Uexküll says, okay, everybody knows sea urchin. You know, it's animal who lives in the sea. I don't know, the word in Flemish might be simple if somebody... Okay, thank you. Okay. So the contrast between von Uexküll made between a dog and a sea urchin is about the same as the depiction of Darwin and the depiction of Lawrence. And when von Uexküll wrote, when a dog runs, the animal moves its legs, and when a sea urchin runs, the legs move the animals. According to this latter contrast, it appears that finally, being a subject doesn't equate to being an agent, because as von Uexküll says, that every animal giving meanings to a word, confronting a word, is a subject. A sea urchin doesn't seem to me to be a subject and an agent. In other words, taking into the account the perspective of another animal may make agency perceptible, salient, or may even enhance it as much as it may not. Agency is not equating perspective. You can have perspective and no agency at all. The dog in von Uexküll depiction is both a subject and an agent. The urchin is solely a subject. The peacock may be a subject and agent in Darwin description, is devoid of agency in classical ethological discourse. I would like to underscore another dimension of the situation. Not only, and I'm sure some of you have thought about it when I was talking, not only the peacock is devoid of any form of agency, but so is the pig, itself being lost in vacuum. Because if the gaze, I'm serious about it, if the gaze of a pig may matter for an exhibitionist peacock, why shouldn't one take into account, and what prevents one from taking it into account, the fact that the pig, a notoriously curious and sensitive being, believe me, I've been working with Jocelyn Porcher, who knows pigs perfectly well, and she said that they are the most curious and the most sensitive beings in the world, probably. So this pig might have responded to the peacock. Look back at it as Donna Haraway would put it, and might have been affected in such a way that affects the peacock in return. Why not imagine these two beings liberated from pure reproductive motives and enjoying together an unprecedented, creative, improvised, and queer becoming together? How long do I have? I'd say that I would talk 30 minutes. I didn't check when I began. Did somebody did? Can you tell me how much I have? 20 minutes. Great. Thank you. I propose testing the link between this proposal and a critique that parallels the reproach Ellen Christ addressed to classical ethology, with its contrast between different narratives. I'm going to talk about a very, very beautiful article I read recently, and an article written mostly about orchids, the pollinators, and the scientists. It's written by two historians of science, Carla Ustak and Natasha Myers. The two scientists who devoted, two historians who devoted the attention and wrote about the way naturalists have conceived and described the practice through which plants lure what I would call the animal partners to secure their fertilization. Ustak and Myers compare Darwin, again, and neo-Darwinian contemporary approaches, which mean sociobiologists. Both historians remark that plants and insects' behavior are, in contemporary discourse, sociobiological discourse, or theories, now grounded in very, very strongly deterministic model that reduce interaction among species to the action of the selfish genes. I don't know if you heard about selfish genes, writing of Dawkins and so on. To put it briefly, it's not a very interesting theory, and I won't last. I still have 18 minutes. I don't want to waste more than 1 minute with it. Sociobiologists say that upon what selection proceed is not the individual, neither the species, is the gene. And so the gene has been selected for the potentiality to be reproduced and to stay in the gene pool, which means, I will make a caricature of it, but it's not so caricatural, believe me, that finally you believe that you act and that you want to act. No, this is your gene that make you acting so they can stay in the gene pool. So if you, for example, are altruistic, which is one of the major issues in the sociobiological discourse, you're altruistic, you just help someone or save someone, it's probably because he shares the same genetic pattern as you are. So you save the same gene, and so you multiply your gene in the population. And so your body is only a vehicle for your genes, and they determine all your behavior. I don't mind about that, you know. I agree to be determined by things. I don't care about that. The only problem is that every action are read and are translated in the same model. So even if I talk here, it's just to propagate my genes in the population. I don't know how I could do that. And I don't wish anyone to help me for doing that. But that's the point of sociobiological discourse. And they say that, for example, a model that is really prevalent is an economic model. And for example, every relationship is seen as a contest, a competition between partners to make the gene proliferate in the population. So even between male and female, there are conflict of interest because males try to propagate the greatest number of genes he can, and the female does also, and they may contradict on that point. For example,
male may try to run after as much female as he can, because he will propagate the genes, and the female is trying to keep the male home in order to secure her own progenitor. So, you see what I mean. Okay, so is the model, and this model applied to every relationship, and is really, really dominant in the field of biology. And so, plants and insect behavior in these sociobiological theories are led by selfish genes. And, for example, every being is trying only to reproduce, to the task of reproducing itself, its reproductive fitness for long-term species survival. Okay. And so is the flower, and so are the bees. However, scientists are sometimes surprised to see that orchids and flowers have the remarkable ability to lure pollinators in spite of the fact that they do not offer the insect a nectar reward. So why does the insect do that? For nothing, probably. But nothing doesn't exist for sociobiologists. I mean, doing something for nothing, for the pleasure of things, for the pleasure of singing, or make love for the pleasure of making love. No, don't think about it. Don't even think about it. So, for them, when orchids attract the pollinators or the bees by exhaling perfume or volatile compounds that mimic the sex pheromone of the insect, and it elicits typical sexual behavior in an insect. You see, for example, it's beautiful to see Darwin observed that male bees, for example, run flowers and expose the genitalia to the flowers before landing. Generally, sociobiologists and biologists in general claim that while trying to mate with the flowers, the bees inadvertently participate to the fertilization. And they say that, in fact, the flowers exploit male insects' sexual proclivities for their own ends, and orchids or flowers are seen as frauds and cheating, and male insects are just produced, exploited, that are mistaken signal that fakes the scent of the conspecific female. That's the way biology translates the behavior. However, Mustek and Myers continue, this example of stories shows how stories emerging in the field of chemical ecology today constrain narratives of interspecies relation along axis of deception and exploitation. These kind of accounts, they note, reduce the complex relation between flowers and insects in a way that stultifies both flowers and insects in genesi and renders ecologies populated by blind, reactive automatons. They note a common characteristic of these narratives. Any hint of interspecies intimacy is carefully policed. No one evoked it. The event of pollination, is an asymmetrical, radically asymmetrical encounter. Since flowers offer no nourishment for visiting insects, the pollination even is not considered as mutually beneficial encounter. Rather, it is a phenomenon engendered through what they call unilateral adaptation of the flowers to the bee, mimicrying orchids are the only participant reaping a benefit from the encounter, and the insects are rendered passive to the wiles of the plants. They note, however, that recent statements in the literature vociferously resist the term coevolution to describe this phenomenon in flowers. Through granted the power to deceive, these plants are still conceived as mechanical actants. I quote, "Their near perfectly attuned aromatic chemistry are not cleverly concocted propositions. They are merely the blind effects of random genetic variation subject to the selective forces imposed by the pollinators. A neo-Darwinian economy, in other words, cannot admit pleasure, play, improvisation within or among species. Plant ecology is thus rendering on a model of militarized economy that structure life as a struggle in a war zone of competitors, enemies, dupes, and deceptive mimics and tactics." And it's funny because when I read this article, I noticed that I never think about perfume as an action. I always think flowers smell. That's the point. They smell good, mostly, not every flower, but most of them, I mean, from our point of view. For dogs, it's another story, I think. But they smell, and for me, smell was, just a state. And it's funny to think that flowers produce smell and may smell differently according to the beings who are around. And I never thought about that. So, back to the description of Myers and Ustack, they suggest that instead to work, they suggest to work instead outward the reductive, mechanistic, and adaptionist logic. This suggests to abandon the adaptationist logic that ground the ecological sense. Not all of them, but partly, to propose another version, and to develop a parallel reading that would amplify the account of the creative, improvisational, and fleeting practice through which plants and insects involve themselves in one another's lives. They say creatures involve themselves in each other's lives. To account for this constant creativity of life, Ustack and Myers propose supplementing evolutionary logics with what they refer to as an involutionary mode of attention. Inspired by biologist Lynn Margulis' proposal, they suggest that if all life shares the same ancestry, the concept that the tree is the right topology should be seriously challenged. According to Margulis, a tree assumes that the lineage continues to branch and branch and branch for a common ancestor. So this is bifurcation, separation, but Margulis pointed to recent work that demonstrated the movement of genetic material from one branch to another, and she insists that this movement makes the topology, maybe that's what I'm trying to do finally, a net, a web, and no longer a tree. If image of tree standing for phylogeny, filial loyalty, and the defense of family line, because the tree's ideology, Lord. Margulis' endosymbiotic theory accounts for evolutionary innovation in the dense tangle of branches. Stackenmeyer's ad, as the Oxford English Dictionary reminds us, evolution is a rolling outwards, a kind of speciation through divergence in the shape of branching trees. We approach involution as the rolling, curling, turning inward. So the trees is going outward, separation, bifurcation, and involution is the coming back to the one we have been separated generation and decade and million of years ago. That brings, involution brings distinct species together to invent new way of life. I think that they talk about involution because of Deleuze talking about involution, creative involution, himself referring to Bergson, evolution créatrice. And I was thinking that Mr. Stackenmeyer said that the Oxford English Dictionary reminds that evolution is rolling outwards. And that involution might infer that regressive pardon, but it's really not that. And they insist that it is a pardon not to come back in the past, but to recreate a new future with some allies of the allies of the past. Okay, let's note that this proposition or these proposals follow also the work of very interesting Evo-Devo theorists like Scott Gilbert. The new theoretical trend of Scott Gilbert and other Evo-Devo radically challenge the generally accepted view of individuals, and that's what interests me. Symbiosis is becoming the core principle in this kind of biology, and it is replacing an essentialist conception of individuality with a conception congruent with the larger systems approach. I quote Scott Gilbert here. We report here that the zoological sciences are finding that animals are composite of many species living, developing, and evolving together. The discovery of symbiosis through the animal kingdom is fundamentally transforming the classical conception of an insular individuality into one in which interactive relationship among species blurs the boundaries of the organism and obscures the notion of essential identity. Therefore, if I go back to Stackenmeyer's, they propose to supplement evolutionary logics with what they refer as the involutionary mode of attention they define as an affective ecology shaped by pleasure, play, and experimental proposition. In an involutionary reading, the mimetic powers of flowers of orchid seductive sense need not to be reduced to the outcome of the selective advantage of random mutation. It is an effect, an affect to immanent, it is an effect, an affect immanent to responsive, sensing, sentient bodies. We may ask, how do agency exist in that depiction and in Meyer's and Ustak's description? First of all, they make agency exist simply by searching for richer narrative. Donna Haraway was writing, and I didn't say this quotation, but I think it's beautiful. She wrote, "It matters what story we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what concept we think to think other concept with." And if Haraway is so careful about stories we tell,
is because she knows that some story may have a sequel, may have something that follows, another not. And I think that Stack and Myers make agency exist because they choose in Darwin narrative exactly the narrative that makes agency exist. And they are the richer narrative. They seek for description that make the activity salient. For example, they quote in Darwin the sequence of action performed by the flowers. Orchid tissues are, according to Darwin, excitable, sensitive, even irritable. The plants can actively alter the anatomies, twisting, turning, torquing their forms in response to insect visitors. Darwin constructs narratives of encounters where both the flower and its companion species, or maybe we should say companion reign, are actively involved in one or another leaves. For example, in his depiction of an insect foraging for nectar, he points out that the orchid would often actively deposit its polonium somewhere on the insect body. He also described at length his observation of other flowers from another species than orchids, which had to succeed to imprison the visiting insect for half an hour. Not only do Stack and Myers re-enchant what has been disenchanted with narratives of what Darwin himself called an inextricable web of affinities. They tell stories of connivence, attraction, reciprocal induction, and also repulsion, and they weave their own narrative in the web and therefore create themselves with their own stories, new narrative, and new affinities and new connection. They also focus our attention on a world rich in affect, full of beings able to affect and being able to be affected by others, flowers, orchids, bees, pigs, peacock, creators involving themselves in one another's lives. Moreover, they carefully follow the practice through which Darwin himself experimented with the flowers, because sometimes Darwin was taking the role with his finger, of course, of the insect. They call for, or they enact, since they are themselves actively involving their own practice, what Isabel Stengers referred to as an ecology of practices between plants, insects, and the scientists who draw the intricate relation into view. These two historians suggest, for example, that by inserting himself into the kinesthetic world and affective relation of insect and orchid, Darwin's experimental practice, when he was touching flowers and mimicrying insects, and so it's funny that he was mimicrying insects to understand the mimicrying flowers. And he was taking, of course, his experimental practice took a mimetic form. And I'm in turn tempted to say and to make the assumption to suggest that taking mimetic form to involve oneself in the life of other beings whose prodigious feats and whose relation actually rest upon mimicry cannot be reduced to mere empathy, nor to a psychological process of identification that makes understanding possible. Rather, it is, I think, and I claim, to get really actually involved in the lives of other beings the very same way they get involved in the lives of each other. That is not only a gesture of mere imitation, it is to enter in the game of reciprocal induction that creates a new connection in the web of inextricable affinities, what we call an affine, for example,
an affine connection. It is to call for a response and to respond to the call we can hear. It is not becoming like insects or flowers in a mimetic process. Let us take seriously the concept of affine, which just refers to the limit of the web of kin at finitum. It is not becoming like the other, it is becoming with them and starting from them. In other words, Darwin enters the historical game of co-evolution himself. He is being, I think that is what is really, really interesting in that proposal of co-evolution, that the scientists who practice and who theorize of co-evolution are themselves taken into the game of co-evolution, because it's a game that undoes and redoes, a game that I would say, following the narrative, remembers the creator that actively involve themselves in the process. And I think that remember has to be taken in this both sense, like the metaplasm asks us to do, this metaphor that changes just one little thing in a world that give it another meaning. And remember is going back to the past, taking memories, make stories of the past be renewed and recomposed. This is the word remember, both meaning in that story. So, finally, what Darwin does and what scientists do is enacting as well as being enacted by new narratives, new assemblage, which in turn activates each of the beings involved and involves more beings in a cascade of practice, or maybe we could say, in that very case, a cascade of poiesis. Thank you.